We often think the greatest battles are fought on streets, in courts, or behind locked doors of power. But sometimes, the most devastating wars take place on nothing more than 64 squares of black and white marble. In a mansion glittering with wealth, where crystal chandeliers sparkled above and whispers of power echoed through champagne glasses, a young black teenager was about to be turned into entertainment, a pawn in a cruel social game he never asked to play. The wealthy hostess, certain of her superiority, believed it would be amusing to pit her maid's son against her in a game of chess. She expected laughter, humiliation, and another story to brag about among her elite friends. But what she didn't know was that this boy, dismissed, underestimated, and mocked, had been preparing for this exact moment his entire life. His nights had been spent hunched over worn-out library books. His mornings began before dawn, solving puzzles under the dim light of a flickering lamp. And now, without warning, he stood at the threshold of rewriting not just a game, but an entire room's perception of race, class, and genius. What began as a joke would soon turn into one of the most unforgettable lessons those walls had ever witnessed. Because when prejudice underestimates brilliance, the result isn't just a victory, it's a revolution. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe to Hidden Black Stories, where we uncover the powerful, untold narratives that challenge prejudice and celebrate resilience. Now let's step into the glittering world of Beverly Hills, a place where luxury drips from every corner, where million-dollar chandeliers hang like trophies, and where the walls of mansions are decorated with art pieces that cost more than most families earn in a lifetime. Among the powerful elite, reputation is a currency, and appearances are everything. This was the stage for the charity gala that would become infamous, not because of the wealth on display, but because of one boy who refused to be underestimated. The host of the evening was Victoria Wittmann, a woman born into privilege so deep that she had never once in her life felt the weight of struggle. To her, hard work was an abstract concept, something she spoke about in public speeches but had never experienced. She wore her arrogance like a diamond necklace, heavy but impossible to ignore. She enjoyed surrounding herself with politicians, businessmen, and socialites, people who shared her view that money was not only power, but proof of superiority. At her side that evening, serving trays of champagne and caviar, was Carmen Santos, her maid of nearly 2 decades. Carmen had walked through that mansion's doors so many times that she knew every corner better than its owner. Yet she was invisible, an afterthought in a house where her labor kept everything pristine, but her presence was barely acknowledged. Her hands bore the marks of endless scrubbing, her back ached from years of bending over polished floors, but her spirit remained unbroken. And standing just behind her, helping with the flow of the evening, was her 17-year-old son, Diego. Diego wasn't supposed to be there that night. His mother had begged him to stay home, to rest, to focus on his studies. But he insisted. He wanted to help ease her burden, to take at least a little weight off her shoulders. To Victoria and her circle of guests, he was just another young face from The Help, someone unworthy of a second thought. Yet behind his quiet presence lived a mind sharper than the crystal glasses he carried, a mind trained not in wealth or private lessons, but in relentless self-discipline and hunger for knowledge. The irony of that night could not be ignored. Victoria's gala had been marketed as a fundraiser for underprivileged youth, a chance for the wealthy to pat themselves on the back for their generosity. Yet, when confronted with the very embodiment of that cause standing in her own living room, Diego, a young man from a working-class black family, she saw not potential, but amusement. To her, he was not someone to uplift, but someone to ridicule. Every laugh from her guests was a dagger. Every careless remark about poverty or the slums cut deeper into the silence Carmen held behind her polite smile. For 20 years, she had swallowed indignities to keep food on the table, but nothing wounded her more than seeing her son worth questioned in front of strangers who measured value only in money and titles. Diego, however, did not flinch. His calmness was disarming, unsettling even. He observed everything with the precision of a chess player analyzing a board, calculating, patient, watching for openings. He was not just looking at people. He was studying them, mapping out their patterns the way he once mapped out every move of grandmasters from dusty library books. This was no ordinary evening. Beneath the chandeliers and soft murmurs of wealth, something far greater than a party was unfolding. A boy born into struggle, sharpened by sacrifice, was about to collide with a woman born into privilege, dulled by entitlement. And when their worlds met across a polished chessboard of Italian marble, the outcome would ripple far beyond the walls of that mansion. Because this was never just about a game. It was about dignity. It was about the invisible labor of a mother who sacrificed everything and the genius of a son who refused to let circumstance dictate his destiny. In the eyes of the rich, he was just a pawn. But pawns, when they reach the other side of the board, transform into something far more powerful, and Diego Santos was about to prove it. As the night unfolded, the charity gala shimmered with the illusion of purpose. Guests moved through the grand living room in designer gowns and tailored suits, their laughter floating like music above the soft notes of a hired string quartet. Yet beneath that polished surface, a quiet cruelty lingered. The wealthy were not just sipping champagne, they were affirming to each other that their status, their privilege, made them untouchable. It was within this atmosphere of smug confidence that the evening took its turn. When Victoria Wittmann announced her intention to test her maid's son at the chessboard, it was not born of generosity or even curiosity. It was spectacle. In her world, wealth gave her the right to define value, to decide who was worthy of respect and who was destined to be laughed at. And Diego, with his tray of sparkling glasses and quiet composure, was the perfect target. Eyes turned toward him with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Some smirked behind their napkins, others whispered predictions about how quickly the boy would crumble. In that room, prejudice was not shouted. It was disguised as jokes, smirks, and dismissive glances. It was the subtle, suffocating racism that cloaked itself in civility, yet struck just as viciously as open hatred. Carmen's heart pounded as she watched. For years, she had endured the silent condescension of this household, swallowing pride to survive. But this moment was different. It wasn't just her being demeaned. It was her son. The boy she had raised through sleepless nights, who had studied under dim light when their electricity was cut, who had walked miles to the public library when they couldn't afford internet. She wanted to shield him, to pull him away from the ridicule she knew was coming, but Diego stood rooted, calm, unreadable. The guests gathered closer to the Italian marble chessboard, a symbol of wealth that now became the stage for a far deeper confrontation. The pieces gleamed under the chandelier, each one worth more than the monthly wage Carmen received after decades of service. To the audience, it was just another ornament of luxury. To Diego, it was familiar territory, a battlefield he had walked countless times in his mind. Yet the ridicule grew heavier. Some whispered that he wouldn't even know how the knights moved. Others chuckled about how long it would take before he embarrassed himself. Their laughter was not just at the game, it was at the audacity of a black teenager daring to share the same space of intellect they reserved for themselves. This wasn't just about chess. It was about proving superiority. And every glance told Diego he didn't belong. But what none of them knew was how prepared he truly was. For nearly a decade, he had poured himself into this game, not for fame or recognition, but because chess had become his sanctuary. While others dismissed him, the 64 squares gave him order, control, and dignity. His strategies were forged in silence, his discipline sharpened by struggle. Each move he learned was not just about a game, but about survival in a world eager to underestimate him. As he approached the board, there was a shift in the room. The arrogance of the guests clashed with a quiet unease, as if they sensed something about this boy that did not fit their assumptions. His composure unnerved them. His stillness carried weight. It was the kind of calm that belonged not to the humiliated, but to someone who knew exactly what he was about to do. Carmen stood in the corner, fists clenched around the tray she still held. Her years of labor had taught her silence, but tonight, silence felt unbearable. She prayed that her son would not be broken by this performance. She prayed that he would endure the cruelty of being reduced to a joke in a room full of people who saw him as nothing more than the Maid's boy. The air grew heavy as the first pieces were placed on the board. This was no longer just a game. Every glance, every smirk, every suppressed laugh weighed down like chains. Diego, however, carried himself with precision. Each gesture, each movement, betrayed none of the anger or humiliation that simmered beneath the surface. He was not there to entertain them. He was there to rewrite the script. The guests expected quick humiliation. Instead, what they would receive was something far more unforgettable, a revelation. They thought they were about to witness the confirmation of their prejudice, but Diego Santos was about to turn their certainty into silence, their arrogance into awe. And with that, the match began. The room hushed as the first pieces clicked against the marble board. At first, the atmosphere was light, almost playful, guests leaning back with smug smiles, certain that this would be nothing more than a moment of cheap amusement. Victoria Whitman, perfectly poised in her designer gown, moved her first pawn forward with the casual confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already guaranteed. Diego answered without hesitation. His hand moved with calm precision, no trace of nerves. To those watching, it seemed mechanical at first, but to anyone who had studied the game, it was clear. This boy was not moving pieces blindly. He was already several steps ahead. Laughter flickered around the room as Victoria tried to appear amused, playing up her role as the superior hostess entertaining her guests. But as the minutes ticked on, the energy began to shift. Diego's moves grew sharper, more deliberate, weaving a pattern invisible to the untrained eye, but undeniable in its effect. Her bishops were cornered. Her pawns collapsed under subtle traps she hadn't even noticed until it was too late. Whispers replaced laughter. The room leaned closer, curiosity sharpening into disbelief. Victoria's smile, once effortless, began to strain. She tapped her fingers against the arm of her chair, hiding the tension building in her chest. Each move she made was countered not with hesitation, but with quiet, devastating precision. For Diego, it wasn't just about winning. Every square he controlled, every piece he claimed, carried the weight of years of invisibility. Each capture was a silent declaration. I am not a pawn. I am not your joke. I am not what you think I am. Carmen watched with trembling hands, her heart in her throat. For so long she had begged her son to be cautious, to stay quiet, to never draw attention in a world eager to punish his brilliance. But here he was, unflinching, dismantling the arrogance of a woman who had built her life on belittling others. Carmen's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of pride she had been forced to bury for too long. Victoria tried to recover, her moves growing faster, sharper, more desperate. But Diego anticipated everything. He was not reacting. He was leading. Every piece she lost, every corner of the board he claimed, chipped away at her carefully constructed image of superiority. The whispers among her guests grew louder, shifting into gasps of shock. The boy they had expected to fail was orchestrating a masterclass in strategy before their very eyes. And then came the turning point. With a move so clean it seemed almost casual, Diego slid his rook across the board, cutting off her queen's only path of escape. Gasps erupted. Even those who had never cared for chess could feel the tension, the inevitability of what was coming. Victoria leaned forward, her polished composure cracking, eyes darting across the board for salvation that wasn't there. In that moment, The power dynamic of the entire evening collapsed. No longer was Diego the boy serving drinks. No longer was Carmen just the invisible maid. For the first time in that mansion's history, the wealthy guests found themselves silent before someone they deemed beneath them. The game stretched on for a few more moves, but the ending was inevitable. Diego's knight leapt into position, his bishop cut off her last defense, and finally, with the precision of a surgeon, his queen slid into place. Checkmate. The sound of the word did not need to be spoken. It echoed in the stillness that followed. A silence so heavy it pressed against every wall of the glittering mansion. Glasses hung suspended in midair, breaths caught in throats. The humiliation was undeniable. Victoria sat frozen, her painted smile shattered. She had not just lost a game, she had lost control. She had turned a boy into a spectacle, and instead, he had turned her into a lesson. The same guests who had smirked and laughed at Diego were now avoiding her eyes, unwilling to acknowledge the collapse of her superiority. Diego leaned back, his expression calm, almost serene. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He simply allowed the silence to speak for him, a silence that carried the weight of every injustice, every slight, every dismissal. It was not just a victory, it was a reckoning. Carmen's tears finally fell, but she did not hide them. They were not tears of shame, but of release. For years she had swallowed her pride, endured the humiliation of servitude, and prayed that her son would find a way out of the invisible chains binding their lives. And here, on 64 squares of marble, he had broken them. The climax of the night was not just about a chessboard. It was about the destruction of arrogance, the unraveling of prejudice, and the undeniable truth that brilliance knows no race, no class, no pedigree. In one breathtaking moment, a boy the world dismissed had redefined the meaning of power. And as the silence lingered, everyone in that room understood. They had just witnessed history in miniature. The silence that followed Diego's victory stretched on longer than anyone expected. For a moment, the glittering mansion seemed to hold its breath. Guests who had once chuckled at the prospect of his failure now avoided one another's gaze, unwilling to confront the truth revealed in front of them. It wasn't just Victoria who had been defeated. It was the arrogance of everyone who had believed themselves untouchable. Victoria sat stiff, her posture cracked under the weight of humiliation. For decades, she had curated an image of refinement, control, and superiority. Yet in the span of a single game, a teenager she considered unworthy had stripped all of that away. Her cheeks flushed, not from the glow of the chandeliers, but from the burning sting of being exposed. Not as powerful, but as vulnerable. Not as brilliant, but as blind. But the true triumph belonged not to her downfall, but to Diego's quiet resilience. He rose from the board without fanfare, without celebration. His victory was not in the applause of others. It was in the dignity he carried within himself. He knew that he had just carved his mark on a world that tried so hard to erase him. His silence spoke louder than any boast. He did not need their validation. The truth was already undeniable. Carmen's eyes followed him, her heart swelling with a pride she had been forced to conceal for so long. She thought of the nights she returned home exhausted, only to find him hunched over borrowed books from the library, scribbling notes under the dim light of a single bulb. She thought of the times he sacrificed sleep, meals, and friendships to chase a dream no one believed possible. And now, all of it had crystallized in this moment, proof that their struggles had never been in vain. For the guests, however, the lesson was far more uncomfortable. They had gathered to celebrate their own generosity, to congratulate themselves on their charity toward the less fortunate. Yet the boy who had just dismantled their illusions was not a nameless beneficiary of their donations. He was standing in the very room, serving them drinks, unseen until he forced them to look. Their wealth could buy marble boards and crystal glasses, but it could not purchase the brilliance born from resilience and hunger. Whispers returned, but they were different now. Not mocking, not amused, unsettled. Some guests tried to spin the outcome in hushed tones, suggesting perhaps Victoria had let him win, or that luck had played a role. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They had underestimated him because of the color of his skin, because of his mother's position, because of their own arrogance. And in doing so, they had been schooled not just in chess, but in humanity. The evening wound down in awkward silence. Victoria made excuses, retreating behind her mask of grace, but the damage was irreversible. Her humiliation became the unspoken headline of the night, and no amount of champagne could wash it away. For Diego and Carmen, though, the impact was far greater. That night was more than a personal victory. It was a crack in the walls that had long confined them. Diego knew his journey was far from over. The world would not suddenly erase its prejudice because of one game. But perhaps the greatest impact was on the audience beyond that mansion, the people listening to this story right now. Because Diego's journey is not just about chess or one wealthy woman's arrogance. It is about every child dismissed before their potential is seen, every parent who sacrifices in silence, every person underestimated because of the color of their skin or the weight of their background. The world is full of Victorias. People who believe brilliance belongs only to those born into privilege. But it is also full of Diegos, voices silenced, talents ignored, yet burning with a brilliance that cannot be denied forever. And every once in a while, the world is forced to pause and witness what happens when prejudice collides with genius. So the next time you find yourself judging someone's worth by the clothes they wear, the job they hold, or the neighborhood they come from, remember the boy who turned a game of chess into a revolution. Remember that pawns, when they reach the other side, become queens. And remember that the most extraordinary victories often come from those the world refuses to see. Because in the end, Diego did more than win a game. He changed the story. And the question we are left with is this: how many other Diegos are we still blind to?